Cute, charming and quirky, but also with a large dose of horror and depression, welcome to my quick review of Omori. Developed for 6 years by Omori and released in 2020 on computers and consoles, Omori follows the adventures of the eponymous character and his friends Hiro, Kel, Abri, Mari and Basil. At first glance the game might seem inspired by Undertale, consider the aesthetics and colorful cast of characters, but in reality they both take inspiration from a much older NES RPG, Earthbound. However, after the first initial impressions, Omori quickly establishes its own identity with not only its unique world, but also a fairly unique subject matter and how it decides to approach it. About 2 hours into the game, out of over 20 it takes to finish it, you'll take control of a second protagonist, or to be more accurate, the actual real protagonist of Omori, Sunny. As it turns out, Sunny is struggling with depression and hasn't left his home for a very long time. That colorful world we started in? Well, it exists only in his mind. The real world is far less welcoming and the main stage to the game's horror elements. Are those figments of his imagination, or is there more to his predicament? That's for the player to discover. And be assured, where the story goes from here is wholly unexpected and definitely the main drama of the game. That is, if you actually decide to pursue this path. You see, a few hours into the game, you'll be given a choice between exploring the real world or just staying in the imaginary one. And honestly, the imaginary one is not as interesting. Omori devotes about 70% of its playthrough to the, as the game calls it, headspace, a beautiful but standard RPG world filled with eccentric but shallow characters, a rather traditional side quest, and both story-driven and optional locations to unlock. Of course, all of it coated in a lot of charm. You don't just talk to 5 NPCs, you instead find and invite 5 lost ghosts to a party. You don't simply buff your party members or debuff your enemies, instead you manipulate their emotions of anger, happiness or sadness. New locations aren't just a rearrangement of existing graphics, instead they are always handcrafted and unlike anything else you've previously seen in this game. And so on and so forth, the list goes on. So it's abundantly clear the developers poured a lot of love into the game. Which is why it's so unfortunate most of it feels like filler. Sunny's imaginary world is just that, imaginary. Sure, it's clearly based on his real-life experiences, including the places he's seen, the friends he made, or even the fears he felt. But at the end of the day, all of it has minimal impact on the main plot, besides some brief moments here and there. Spending few hours trying to reconcile Space Boyfriend with his love, sweetheart, or saving your friends from the jaws of Mr. Jawsome can be funny, but it isn't really challenging or thought-provoking. It's a charming adventure without much substance. Which is actually the opposite of what you can expect from the real world, which plays by a completely different set of rules. Here battles are rare and mostly optional, you don't gain experience or learn new skills, the money is hard to come by, and your decisions have actual consequences. Even the side stories impact the ending. But the most important difference here is that this is where the main meat of the story is. You will quickly discover that Sunny and his friends experienced some tragedy in their past and are now coming to terms with it in their own ways. The real world is about exploring what exactly does this entail. So going back to the choice I mentioned before. On one hand you have an imaginary world that serves mostly as filler, and on the other you have the real world, with enticing mysterious tragedy your friends are struggling with. Which one sounds better to you? Well, it doesn't matter because the headspace escapades will still take majority of your playthrough. Omori is a perfect example of a game where more doesn't necessarily mean better. My final score, 7 out of 10. Omori presents a compelling story buried under a vast amount of fluffy content. If you're looking for a game that's laser focused on delivering its story, then Omori might not be a game for you. But if you enjoy little moments, going on funny side quests, experiencing quirky personalities, and exploring charming environments, then Omori just might become your favorite game of all time. Thanks for watching.